So I'm Fiona, and I'm a software engineer at Etsy on the search ranking team, and I'm a little bit sick today, so I hope you'll bear with me if I am a little bit sick. But I'm going to talk today about some problems that I work on at Etsy. I'm going to explain on kind of like a high level how search and search ranking work. But in the greater scheme of the talk, these topics are really a platform to explore how our company values and our values as individuals get expressed through the engineering work that we do. So it's kind of like a ooey gooey topic, but it's something that I didn't think about much when I was studying computer science in college and thinking forward to my career as an engineer. But in fact, it's like a really important aspect of our work, and not just at Etsy or when working on search, but really in any context. But for a bit of context about my context, for those of you who might not be familiar with Etsy, Etsy is an online marketplace for handmade items, vintage, and craft supplies. And it's peer-to-peer, so kind of like eBay, you can join to buy things, to sell things, or to do both. And in fact, there's like a really big intersection between our buyers and our sellers. It's really a community of people who are deeply interconnected. And we're based in Brooklyn, New York, so this is a picture from our office, our headquarters, where I work in Brooklyn. To give a sense for the scale of Etsy, as of June 2015, we've got 21 million buyers and 1.5 million active sellers. And those sellers have collectively listed over 30 million items that are for sale right now. We call items on the site listings, so I might keep switching back and forth between that terminology throughout the talk. So I'm going to talk about my job, which is searching across those tens of millions of items and connecting those those millions of buyers and sellers. And my job is very easy when a buyer searches for something like this, something like banana leaf print cushion cover. And it's easy because our users really want simple things on the surface. A buyer wants to see the best relevant items, and a seller wants a buyer to see their items. They want to get, what they made in front of people. So in this case, there are 4 of these. They all show up. So we've really made both parties happy. But our marketplace is not uniformly distributed, and not all queries are quite this specific. So many common queries like necklace return millions of items. I don't know if you can see this, but the necklace returns over 3 million items, all of which are necklaces. So this is a mixed bag for the buyer. They might be happy with the selection in the query, but overwhelmed by the magnitude of results that they have to wade through. But by the definition of a happy seller from before, only a handful of sellers out of the millions are going to be happy with these results because only a handful show up and get what they made in front of the buyer. Competition in a marketplace the size of Etsy is, of course, inevitable, and it serves our buyers well in some contexts. But the stakes for our sellers are really high. So I searched, and there's actually almost 500 listings specifically for Etsy SEO guides or personal sessions with Etsy SEO experts listed on Etsy, actually as listings on Etsy. And it goes to show, sellers treat SEO on Etsy as seriously as Etsy treats its SEO in the context of Google or other search engines. And I actually worked on SEO for a few months, so I'm very empathetic to this process and how it can feel to kind of be reverse engineering a search algorithm. So our sellers are really serious, they run real businesses, and they put in a lot of work. So it's our obligation to make sure that the ranking is fair and well communicated. The optimal solution for everybody is, of course, to return the best possible listings for any query. And this is an obvious goal, but it's not really specific enough to be useful in guiding a ranking algorithm. So let's deep dive on best. What we want is to create a system that values informative and readable data, which is accurate, and which has kind of a notion of the quality of the document, the quality of the listings. So we want to return the most informative and honest and high-quality listings. But we also need to think about the results set holistically and over time. So we want to make sure that the results express the breadth of our marketplace, that they express like the full range of things that are available to whatever extent we can. And that they change often enough to feel fresh and dynamic. So this is a better articulated objective of a ranking system, to return a diverse, fresh mix of the most informative, honest, and high-quality listings. So going back to the theme of the talk, this is a mural near my desk in Brooklyn, and I kind of contrast tweaked this to see if it could be readable. But if you can't read it, it says, "Buy good things from real people." And I like this mural because it reminds me that effective search serves both interests well. It helps you as a searcher discover great items, and it's also connecting you with someone real on the other side who's impacted by being found and who wants to get wants you to see what they've made. So when we frame it as trying to connect people, it's not a conflict of interest, and it's a space where we can kind of express our values as a company and as people who work at a company through our work. So as I mentioned, this talk is about expressing our values, and Etsy has 5 core values that we've articulated as a company. So I've broken this talk out with each section corresponding more or less to one of these values, so don't worry about reading them because they'll all come back in the rest of the talk. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is basic gameability of the search ranking, meaning how easy is it to get a good score by being dishonest, or if not dishonest, disingenuous somehow, and how can we combat that? So this corresponds to our principle of keeping it real, because we want our marketplace to benefit sellers who are authentic and genuine in the information that they provide to us and to buyers. And so we want to keep it real always. So this is a fanzine that I actually made in high school, and I'm going to list it on Etsy. It has a lot of sentimental value to me, so I haven't really priced it to sell quick. I've priced it at $100, but I still want to get it out there in front of people and optimize for search. So to quickly explain how a search engine works in a nutshell, the vast majority of search engines you've used in your life are based on this really basic data structure called an inverted index. And an inverted index is like the index at the back of a book, because it provides a reference from a term to the places where you can find that term. So in this case, that's the IDs of the listings, some identifier for the item in question. So a super simplified, super abbreviated search index for Etsy might look something like this, where say that my document ID is 100. Those terms that you saw in my title, Girls Guitar Club, issue number 1, fanzine, music zine, have a reference to my document. And what's so great about this data structure is that it provides super speedy lookup to find all the documents that match a query. So when a user comes in and they type in zine to Etsy search, we don't have to inspect every document and say, does this seem like a zine? Does this contain the word zine? We already have that list, and we can just grab all those documents. It's so beautiful because it's so simple, and simultaneously it's really powerful. But like anything beautiful and simple, of course, in reality, it gets a bit more complicated, and we need a little bit of extra data. So instead of having the value in the mapping be a flat list of IDs, in reality, we want to encode some information about where and how many times this term appears in the text. So instead of a flat list of IDs, we have ID and the positions. So zine appears in my listing as the 3rd and 8th terms. You can take my word on it being the 8th term, I guess. But so the index would store 3 and 8 as the positions associated with that term in that document. One thing this is useful for is determining when terms appear next to each other or very close to each other. So anytime that you've typed in to a search engine with quotes around 2 or more terms so that they appear next to each other, it's using that positional index to say, does it look like this term, the first term, appears 1 position before the second term? And that's how you're able to do something like phrase match. But it's not just useful for phrase match and figuring out which documents to return, it's also useful for ranking those documents, and I'll explain why that is. So most search engines you've used in your life also use a really simple measure of what we call topicality. Topicality says, how much is this what the user's looking for? And that measure is called TF-IDF, and it's one number that tells the ranking algorithm essentially how important is it that the document matches this term. And I'll break it down. So the first part of TF-IDF is TF, which stands for term frequency, and that's the count of the term in the document. So the count of the term in the document is easy to get when we know how many positions it appears in, because it's just the length of the list of positions. The second part is IDF. That's a bit more complicated. It's inverse document frequency. And IDF tells us, essentially the idea is the rarer a term is in the context of the collection at large, the more important it is in determining the relevance of the document to the query. So the way many people define IDF is the log of the total number of documents defined by the frequency of the term in all those documents, with some ones added to avoid dividing by 0. But it really, anything that inversely grows as the count of the term in the total document set grows is a good measure of IDF. So to give an intuition for what a real IDF value might be, at Etsy the term jewelry has an IDF of 1.2 because it's very common. And the term pepperoni has an IDF of 4.4 because it's very rare. So pepperoni would be a more important component of the score of a match on pepperoni jewelry, which, by the way, returns over 500 items on Etsy. So if you want to check that out later, feel free. So back to my listing. Zooming in on the title. In this context, the TF of zine is 2 because it shows up twice. And the IDF of zine happens to be on the order of 3.3 because it's rarer than jewelry but less rare than pepperoni, as you might expect. So with TF-IDF, this is the best possible listing that I could create. It's 10 times as relevant to the query zine because I put the word zine in the title 20 times instead of 2 times. Maybe even more because I put it in all caps. So this is somewhat honest. You know, I am listing a zine, but it's not informative and it's not readable and it's not like the kinds of titles that we want our listings to have on Etsy. So the really simple solution to this is just to normalize TF to 1. So rather than multiplying by the term frequency, we just multiply by 1 in all contexts. So we just drop TF from the equation. So in this case, both of my listings would be equally relevant to zine, and the first one would have a big advantage because it also has a chance to match on music and guitar and all sorts of other things. So this is an example of how, by being conscious about how we rank listings, we don't have to police user behavior or be the bad guy or have a lot of work done on that front. We just set up a system that rewards the kind of information that we want, and then we get that kind of information. Cool. So if we're not paying attention to term frequency, what separates one listing with zine in the title from another listing with zine in the title? And the answer is we need some notion of quality or authority. We value craftsmanship in all that we make, and our quality signal is how we reward great craftsmanship in our sellers. So doing this fairly is kind of an interesting technical challenge, but we want to reward craftsmanship. So again, this is the first fanzine that I made, and this is the second issue of my fanzine, and I got a lot better at making cool fonts. I realized that crayons don't really photocopy that well, so I've listed this much higher quality item, and I priced it at $200 because it is that much better. So essentially, the idea of figuring out which of these listings is higher quality is that we want to see how users react to it when they see it in search. So given that a user saw this listing, did they click on it? Did they buy it? Did they favorite it? Did they interact with it in some way? So when any of those actions happen, we record that, and we log it, and we move it to a distributed file system. So we use Hadoop at Etsy. And this is going to be super hand-wavy because our quality score is both pretty complicated and it's very sensitive. But essentially, we write MapReduce jobs on the data stored in Hadoop, and then we recompute the quality score of our listings when we get new information. So it's a super simple story. When a listing outperforms our expectations, we increase its score. And the major thing that we have to look out for in kind of a naive implementation of this is what we call presentation bias. So here's how my listings might show up in search. And issue number 1 happens to be more likely to be clicked just by virtue of being the first result returned. We don't want to think it's a better listing just because it returned in the first spot, because that's a feedback loop where the first listings get higher quality ad infinitum. So what we do is we introduce a small amount of randomness into the result ranking. We swap listings after they've been ranked by our search algorithm so that we can fairly compare listings in the same position to each other and watch which one wins on click rate, engagement rate, et cetera. So this is fairly trivial, but to keep the score up to date, this is how we calculate that score. We still have that IDF component for topicality, and then we multiply it by the quality score for the document. Cool. So this section is maybe the biggest stretch in terms of the match between the value and the topic, but I'm going to talk about how we keep high-quality sellers from getting into a feedback loop and dominating the results. Having boring, samey results would be no fun, and we believe that fun should be part of everything we do, so we want to spice up the results a little bit. So imagine that my listings are a huge hit, they consistently outperform other listings, and I get a really high quality score. So all I need to do is dupe them a few times, or maybe finally finish the series, and I can stage a full takeover of the query zine. So this is good for one person. This is good for me, because I always get my listings in front of people. It's bad for other sellers, because they are not being returned in results, and it's really bad for buyers, because they can't see the full range of options that are available for them to buy. So what we do is we diversify the results set by seller. And again, I'm not going to get too much into the details of how we define diversity and how we approach this because it's a really sensitive topic, but I am going to get a little bit into the mechanism because I think it's kind of neat. So here's a simplified version, and don't worry about reading this, of the code that we use to progressively reshuffle results until we reach the desired level of diversity. And here's the interesting component of that code. So we have a simple low-level interface to integrate listing results broken out by seller ID or whatever field. And then we iteratively apply that to larger and larger portions of the result set until we have the level of diversity that we want. So we're just taking this window and increasing it until we have enough candidates to achieve that level of diversity that looks good. And this is what that looks like. So adding diversity gives the buyer a much broader range of results to choose from, and it just expresses the breadth of our marketplace a lot better. We also want items to be fresh across time. So this is what Etsy search looked like a few years ago, courtesy of Wayback Machine. And up until this time, around summer 2011, Etsy listing search was actually sorted by recency by default. So the newest items that matched a query would always be at the top, the oldest ones would be at the bottom. And we wouldn't want to go back to that because it's not a very sophisticated way of doing things. But it turns out that moderately boosting recently created items really helps the search results feel fresh over time. And another benefit of this is that it gives more exposure to newer sellers so that we can get information about the quality of their listings. And that feeds into like a healthy quality score. So with something like this, we can subtract the creation date from the current time, and keep the boost value between 0 and 0.1 or something. And then by adding that to 1, we can constrain the impact of the recency boost to something like a 10% boost or a 5% boost or whatever feels appropriate. So it's much more moderate than sorting by recency, but it's still pretty useful. It still helps keep things fresh. So this is one of my favorite Etsy values, that we as a business plan and build for the long term. And we want our sellers to be able to do that too. So freshness in the sense of shop diversity, freshness in the sense of recency is kind of a known constant that our sellers can plan around, but more fundamental ranking changes can really affect their ability to plan for their business. And this icon is really appropriate because this section is really about the tooling that we use. So one way that we evaluate changes is, of course, we'll run an A/B experiment and see which experience performs better. But even if we do this with the intent of making relatively small changes and the intent of making good changes, the experiment itself affects real buyers, real searchers, and in turn it affects real sellers. So to whatever extent that we can, we really want to determine the viability of a change and the quality of a change before that we expose it to real traffic. So we call that an offline test versus an A/B experiment would be an online test. So Tire is the tool that we built to do this. And what Tire does is it samples real search requests issued by users that we captured in our logs and optionally unites them with some information about that user's session that might be helpful in some cases. It lets us plug in code, either default code or handwritten code, to filter or modify those requests to either zoom in on one population or create a population artificially that we're interested in. And then it runs them on our search cluster and it calculates statistics on the results that come back. So don't worry about reading this, but I'll zoom in a little bit. This is what the statistics that come back look like. And essentially what this does, this is a metric called rank shift. It shows me, for each request, the items that move the furthest within that request. 7.4 of them, that first number, moved 1 or 2 spots. 6.1% of them moved more than 500 spots, so they were either completely introduced to the result set or completely removed. And if you look all the way over to the right, 70% of them, no listing moved at all. So this is pretty granular, but it gives us really strong guarantees about how much we're changing the result set in the worst case, in the average case, in the best case, and how much we can expect to impact both buyers and sellers. So that tool, Tire, is really great for getting those strong guarantees about the impact of an experiment. But sometimes we really just want to build an intuition for a change. I made this change. What does it look like? How did it affect the way that the results look? So we have another tool that we call Rank Delta. And this tool does this kind of a similar thing in that it issues those requests and gets the results back, but it formats them in a way that looks like they look kind of on Etsy. And so this tool also provides an interface for either getting human ratings from Etsy employees or from yourself, or from Etsy users that we pay in gift cards to tell us, we've changed these results, which side looks better. So we always run A/B experiments on live traffic before we launch an experiment to 100%. But in guiding what we choose to experiment with online, offline experimentation is a much quicker and much less disruptive way of tuning those changes. So we prioritize it and we spend time building those tools because it's important that search feels steady enough that our users can trust it. So the last topic on the agenda is communicating about ranking. So when we're mindful and humane about how we do things, we can be transparent without worrying too much about what we say, as evidenced really by the fact that I can give a talk about search ranking in public at all. But at the same time, we need to be able to experiment in a controlled environment, so we need to have a little wiggle room to change the ranking so that we can improve it. So we have a great seller handbook created by our communications team at Etsy, and they've written 24 articles about Etsy SEO and getting found on Etsy, ranging from like the basics about how the search engine works to much more subtle issues like co-optimizing for Etsy search and Google search. And 24 is a lot, but it's really not overkill at all when you remember that there are hundreds of Etsy-specific SEO guides for sale on Etsy. So one really important thing when we communicate with users about the system, we want to focus on attributes that are unlikely to change, because we don't want sellers to have to keep checking in on the documentation, keep changing their listings, re-optimizing their listings to make sure that they rank. But when it comes to the more specific stuff, sellers have really contextual needs. They know what they're doing in the context of their own business and their own audience. So rather than trying to dive in deep on how do you rank for jewelry and how do you rank for this or that, what we do is we provide detailed information in a tool called Shop Stats about how many times each listing is viewed and where those listing views are coming from. including like top keywords attributable to Etsy and Google search. And through that mechanism, this is my shop stats. You can see I didn't get like a ton of traction with my zines, but I can see that music and guitar related queries are performing a lot better than branded Girls Guitar Club queries or something like that. So I know what to optimize for. So by explaining the consistent components of our algorithm clearly and then giving insight into what's going on elsewhere, we don't need to go into super specifics about all the details, and we can make incremental improvements without causing too much work for our sellers. So this is kind of coming to the end. I've given some specific examples of things that we do at Etsy, and hopefully I've given some insight into how search works in general, and I hope that you think it's as fascinating and as simple and powerful as I do. But what I hope really came across is that specific technical solutions, specific lines of code, specific design decisions can be an expression of our values and shape the community that uses them. So thank you so much for listening. This is my information. And I want to plug Code is Craft. Code is Craft is our engineering blog, and we've done some search-specific posts recently that you should definitely check out if you're interested. And so I'm going to take questions outside. So if you're interested in this and you have any questions, come find me outside, or throughout the rest of the day, I'll be around all day to take questions. So thank you so much.